Hello and welcome to AXSchat. We're delighted to have Anne Douglas with us today. Anne is the author of Parenting Through the Storm, Find Help, Hope and Strength When Your Child Has Psychological Problems, and is also the weekend parenting columnist for CBC Radio, CBC being Canada's public broadcaster. So welcome, Anne. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you. I'm very excited.
Well, likewise. Can you tell us a bit how you came to be engaged in this space?
Absolutely.
Backstory.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm sort of involved on two levels. First of all, I'm the parent of 4 children who experienced a number of different struggles when they were younger, mental health challenges, neurodevelopmental issues, behavioral problems, all those kind of things. And then I also have my own, couple of things. I guess I live with a bipolar disorder diagnosis, and I also recently was diagnosed with this exciting thing called Meniere's disease, which anybody who has it is going, oh, so exciting, congratulations, welcome to the club. It is a balance and dizziness disorder, and I'm just trying to find my feet again after a particularly nasty month of January.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I've had the inner ear issues where
Yes.
you lose your balance. Yeah, it's not fun.
No, not much at all.
No. So okay, so I think mental health is such a huge issue. It's one that doesn't get enough airtime. We're always happy to talk about it here. Deborah and I are both quite open about the challenges that we've faced. Hasn't always been the case, though, and I think that we, like others, want to encourage people to feel able to talk about it. It's one of the last, I think, disabilities, hidden disabilities particularly, don't get talked about.
Yes.
And it's great that you are open and talking about it, because the more that we do, the better that we, the better it is for everyone else. So trying to create that kind of atmosphere that people can feel safe.
I think it's so important because I think that sometimes the stories that hit the media are extreme cases, people struggling at their worst. And for the majority of people who are living with some kind of mental illness, you're on a continuum, right? There are times when it's really tough, and then there are times when you almost forget that you have some kind of struggle going on in the background of your life. So I think we need to get more of those stories to the forefront. And I always love it when a friend on Twitter will talk about how, they've gone out for their morning run to help manage their anxiety, because that shows us real people today doing it and living with it and having the best possible quality of life. So
yes.
I was kind of rude the way I jumped in and took over there, but I'm pretty passionate. Now I'll tell myself.
No. We're here to talk about you, or rather have you talk to us. We spend enough time talking. So although I do know that Deborah has a question, so go for it,
and I appreciate that you jumped in like that, because what this conversation continues to tell us is that we're human beings.
Yes.
And so I have not had the meeting a perfect human being yet. I've thought at times maybe I'd met a perfect human, but we just, and the Meniere's disease, I can really identify with it. It's I remember the first time I had it, I was in my son's room, and he was a baby, he was a toddler at the time, and I had laid down with him to try to get him to go back to sleep. And the next morning he'd gotten out of bed and I'd fallen asleep in his bed, and I got out of bed and crashing to the floor and being so confused and thinking, what happened to gravity? And I just, it was really, really tough. And I have a whole story there, which I won't get into, but it was really tough. And then my doctor announced to me that this would probably happen again. And it actually did happen multiple times. I've learned there are certain keys, like you said, the winter for you, Anne. There's certain times I seem to be more susceptible to it. The allergy season seems to cause me problems, but it is really debilitating. It's really debilitating. And I know it happens to a lot of women. And it's interesting then tying it with the mental health, because you have like you said, a diagnosis of bipolar. Well, I remember watching Oprah gosh, 20 years ago, and she showed these extreme cases of bipolar, which really just scared us all to death. And then you saw characters on television, like I remember a favorite character of mine on 6 Feet Under. I loved that show. And the main character had bipolar, and he was so unstable and scary. And I think a lot of, and I also remember, Anne, that I had an employee that started working for me. And in the United States, of course, we can't ask what your disability is. But I think he wanted to disclose that he had bipolar. And so how he did it, he just said, oh, by the way, here's the organizations that I'm part of. And they were all bipolar organizations. And so over the years, we talked about it. And because you're doing it, you're living a very fulfilling, very, good life. You're making a difference in your life. So these labels, knowing when to own them, which I know that Neil talked about that a little bit, knowing when to come out, knowing when to embrace the label, but understand, I'm not telling you I have this label of depression and ADHD. I'm telling you because I'm a human being. I'm a multidimensional human being. And I can add a lot of value to the conversation. So, and I'll tell you also, Anne, you were kind enough a few months ago, or your publisher, to send me a copy of your book. And I actually went through a significant time period with my father-in-law passing away and my daughter backed out. And I found your book very, very helpful and comforting to me.
Oh,
and so invited you to be on the program at that point. But really, I just love the title too, Parenting Through a Storm, and you could even replace parenting with living through a storm, right, Anne?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Powerful data. And how do you pull it all together and have this great professional career, and you have the kids all over the world? I mean, how are you doing it? Because I think a lot of people are probably wondering, how in the world do I do this?
Right. Well, right now on my to-do list, it's mid-January, and in the calendar world, it's mid-March. So sometimes the wheels fall off the bus, as they say, right? And because of like the Meniere's thing and then the anxiety, sometimes the anxiety can fuel the Meniere's and so on. So I've had to say to myself, you know what? Sometimes things fall apart temporarily, and all I can do is the best I can do in a given day. And luckily, my publisher has been very supportive. But in terms of putting together a book project like Parenting Through the Storm, it's a mammoth undertaking. And I know that right now because I'm staring down another book deadline later in the year. And so it's all about talking to a large number of families, because I think it's that firsthand family experience that that really resonates with me and I think other people. And it's also about going through, like, I think I read 1,000 journal articles when I was researching the book, because you want to know what's best practice and what will actually make things better, because we know there's that opportunity cost where people maybe are pulled towards something that isn't proven yet or is too experimental, and they might spend a lot of time and money and missed opportunities sort of, taking a U-turn that is hard on them and maybe their child or family member who's struggling. So trying to do that balance, but not disregarding things that are maybe emerging. So it's like trying to weave that path of what could be helpful, where, where's the evidence going, maybe asking some questions, pointing people in, towards some really powerful ideas, like the whole idea of recovery and, the fact that there will be setbacks. Life isn't always a forward path, but that as a family and as an individual, you can learn how to do this little dodge and weave dance over time.
I agree. And I think that's once again why I loved the title of your book, Parenting Through a Storm, because the reality is we're going to have storms in our life. So let me pass the mic over to Antonio. I know he had a question for you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you so much for being with us. And I remember around 2001 to 2002 to read a book from Paul Auster. The name of the book, I think, I Thought My Father Was God, where he was collecting stories from a show that he had for NPR. They collected a lot of stories over the weekend, so people end up submitting stories about their lives, and some of the stories, they seem absurd, but somehow are able to describe the life of their listeners. Is there, when you are engaging with people socially and on the channels, what type of stories are you able to make people talk around. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, for me, it's always about really establishing trust. And that means letting people know that they're safe to share their story with you. And I am known for being extremely protective of people whose stories are shared with me because they're being vulnerable. So I give people the options of, masking their identity, because in a perfect world, it wouldn't be an issue if your child had a particular diagnosis. But in some people's lives, it's a huge deal. And maybe there are family members who are not dealing well. Maybe there are employment issues. There can be like a cascade of things. And I'm always saddened by the fear, because sometimes parents will say, well, if this illness was ever linked to my child's name, he'd be unemployable. Well, that should never, ever be the case, but we still know that, discrimination can be an issue. So I understand that, and it's about having conversations over time. So sometimes I'll interview people via email because that'll be their preference. Other times I'll have like a Skype conversation, and then I'll take detailed interview notes. But always I send back what the person has sent me. I get explicit permission to use their story, and I tell them, so, in the context it's going to be used to the extent that it's possible. I mean, editing happens, right? But I just want to make sure that I'm always really fair and gentle to other people's stories. And even with my own family's stories, I mean, the week before my book came out in Canada, I was having the worst insomnia because I was sitting there thinking, I wrote this book because I really want to help people, but what if I've ruined my family's lives by being too honest? But maybe it was the right thing to do, instead of, flipping back and forth and worrying and so on. And I have to tell you that the Canadian edition has been out for about 2 years. The American World edition just came out a couple of months ago. And I've only seen a couple of really harsh and unhelpful comments on the internet, which is pretty good for the internet. And, there were a couple of people who said, well, obviously this person should never have written a book about parenting through the storm. If her family was engulfed in a storm, she must be a terrible parent. What could she possibly have to contribute to the discussion? But I feel like because I have lived through this, I tried to do the best by my kids. I certainly wasn't a perfect parent because, as Deborah said, there is no such thing as a perfect person on the planet. But at least I could frame it in the context of empathy. I could share my kids' experiences with their explicit permission in a context that was honest, but also showing family and individual strength. Because nobody wants their family to be like the poster child for bad things that can happen in the world. So I never would have considered writing from that perspective, just because I guess I'm a naturally happy and optimistic person, and I try to sort of see things in terms of possibility.
No, we in the past, not that time long time ago, we have people who sometimes talk with us when they meet us outside the chat. They don't even sometimes they don't participate on the Twitter chat, but they observe what is happening, and they say, "Oh, I don't want to engage on a tweet, or I don't want to comment or like because I'm afraid that I'll be pointing some signals to the people that follow me, to my boss." So it's still a reality that people sometimes may not like to engage with conversations, but they end up reading that, and they have a more passive approach to this type of engagement because they are still afraid of disclosing, or sometimes it's not actually disclosing, just pointing at some small signals that others can judge them in relation to who they are. So unfortunately, that's still a reality. So I think it's at the same time it's good to have the real life stories, because sometimes if you don't have them, people always relate, oh, this is something trying to create some false empathy with me, and at the end, that is not great if you are trying to educate and create trust with people.
Right.
So I'll pass back to you, Neil and Deborah.
Okay, great. So I think that quite often people associate bipolar and depression with people being miserable the whole time. And you said you've been diagnosed with bipolar, and yet you described yourself as an optimistic person. And
Yes.
I think this is a really important point to pick up on. I consider myself also to be an optimist, and yet have had periods where I've gone through depression. And I think that sometimes actually the depression is because of the optimism. It's like, I believe the world to be good, and look at this crap.
Yeah, the life drags the rug out from under you, just to give you a little reality check.
But I think that people don't necessarily have that perception. So people's perception of people that describe themselves as being bipolar or being having experienced depression, they assume that we're all going to be miserable and that we're all going to see life as crappy. So I think it's a really interesting thing to bring to the fore, is actually, you know, I see myself as an optimist. I wouldn't have Deborah as a pessimist. You know, I think Deborah is seeing the good in things. So I wonder whether, you know, in your research for your book, whether or not that's actually a common thread, and that you see more optimists than pessimists.
I think particularly the people who are willing to be interviewed for a book like this, if their feeling was, well, it's hopeless, you can never make things better for your child or your family, they wouldn't engage in the process. So it's probably skewed a little bit that way. But I do think it's also important to sort of, you know, like to balance it out with the reality. I mean, I'll give you a very concrete example from my own life recently. I mean, when I was lying on the floor for 2 hours in the bathroom throwing up in January, and then sleeping on the floor for 2 hours on the bathroom floor in January, there was a moment where I started to panic at first, and I thought, I can't do this forever. Like, this is just too much. This is just really horrible. And then I said to myself, but it's only, with your pattern of these attacks, it's only about 2 hours that you're violently ill. Then you sleep for a couple of hours, then it takes you a couple of weeks to get back on your feet. But I mean, the massive improvement over the couple of hours is huge. And I said to myself, this is now the 4th time you've done this. You know you can do this, and you'll start to feel better soon. So keeping it in perspective. Likewise with the mental health thing. Sometimes when I'm going into a period of depression, I feel like I'm on an elevator and it's sinking. It's like there's this physical sinking, dropping, being pulled down kind of feeling. And at first, I'll say to myself, oh no, I'm falling into the bottomless pit, and I can't see the bottom, and I don't know when it's going to start to feel better, or the wheels start, you know, coming off the bus, and I feel anxious, and it's a horrible thing. But then if I remind myself, I have been through really hard things in the past. I mean, I've been through the stillbirth of a child. We had a small house fire. When I was using that example before, it wasn't entirely hypothetical. Like, I know I have coped with other things. So I think it's like building up that resilience and reminding yourself that you've been through harder things in the past than what you're currently dealing with. Then you can sort of say, I can manage this. And I've learned so many things over the years. Like, you know, when your life falls apart, you do life triage. It's like, okay, we're not cleaning the basement this year. Yay, that's off the list. And, you know, we're not doing anything non-essential, and we're going to maximize self-care. So when we had the house fire and we had to live in a hotel as a family for 9 weeks, it's like, I am getting my walks in every day, because if I don't get my walks in, I'm not going to be somebody anybody wants to share a hotel room with, because I'm going to be so grumpy and edgy and weepy. So, you know, you immediately go into sort of self-care mode and get rid of the non-essentials of life. Reach out for social support, be honest with people. Like, I had just confirmed a book deadline with my editor in January, an hour before that vertigo attack. So later in the day, I said, you know what? I think I'm going to need a little more time, because he had checked in with me. Just wanted to see if everything's going really well with delivery of the manuscript revisions at the end of the month. It's like, no problem. I have it covered. And then the universe laughed and decided to smack me down. And so then I had to recover a little bit. But, you know, I've learned that it's so much better to just say, this is what I'm dealing with right now. This is my game plan. Sometimes it takes a while to even come up with your game plan. And then you don't have to feel guilty. You don't have to feel like you've let other people down, which is the worst feeling in the world. How could it be my fault if I had this attack? Or how could it be my fault if I'm depressed? It's just a thing that happens, and then you hit the reset button and you move on. If you work with good people.
Right. Right. And if you trust yourself. And, you know, I talked about on my other program, Human Potential at Work, about right now, especially just speaking from the perspective of the United States, there are a lot of people that are very traumatized in the United States based on some of our recent decisions and things that are unfolding beyond many of our control. And I think there are quite a few people in the United States that have mental health issues, like myself and some of my family members and my loved ones. And I often wonder, you know, I've said this to my husband, who hasn't ever really had these problems. It's like, what is it like not ever having that? Because sometimes I feel like I've got this little, you know, this little shadow that walks with me. I don't know, but I think you're right, Anne, in that, you know, when you were walking that very traumatic path of a house fire and living in a hotel for 4 weeks, you're like, this is not the time to cut out my walks. This is not the time to not eat right and to take the time to meditate or pray or whatever we do to in our lives. But I do think it's interesting when you have large numbers of people feeling traumatized and depressed. I noticed in the United States when I was driving around before our holidays, the driving was a lot more aggressive. I noticed in just the grocery stores, people just seemed a little bit more on edge. You could actually really feel the energy, and I felt very empathetic for that. I felt not only sad myself, but I was watching other people. So sometimes we forget that we also can pick up about what's happening all around us as well. So how do we navigate during those times?
That is so wise. And you know what? I started feeling myself really sinking at the end of January, and I actually wrote this blog post called How to Avoid Being Psychologically Destroyed by Your News Feed. Because there was one night, it was a Sunday night, and I was up late and I was reading all the horrific news. It's like, well, this horrible thing happened, and then there's the potential for this other horrible thing to happen. And I just was sitting there thinking, like, feeling like everything I ever cared about, all my root values in the world, everything, all the premises I had based my entire life and work on, like, no big deal, it's all falling apart. And I realized I cannot subject myself 24 hours a day to reading an endless feed of bad news. Now, of course, I'm always going to be an obsessively plugged in news consumer. I mean, I listen to NPR when I'm on the treadmill, and I read, you know, all kinds of other things. And, you know, I have sort of like a standard news diet, but I can't get into this sort of catastrophic, you know the word I'm trying to say, sort of thinking of the worst case scenario on an ongoing basis and getting mired in that. So I wrote this post to sort of tell people it's okay to back away. There's a difference between being informed and being immersed, and how to practice self-care, look for opportunities to make a small difference right now, and so on. And I have to remind myself on a regular basis, because some news weeks are bad and some are horrific and some are merely awful. So
I know. And I went on a major news diet, and I'm very active on social media, but there are a lot of hashtags. One hashtag is very popular. Not my president, for example, in the United States is a popular hashtag. I stay away from a lot of that because it actually, I remember one time I was walking through, and the news was on, and it was talking about hurricanes and tornadoes in Georgia, and 18 people had died, and it was coming up the coast. And then they went to a feed of something that was happening with our president, and I was there for 5 minutes, and I was so traumatized. I thought, oh my God, we're all dead, and it's coming for. I think you have to know what you can handle and what you can't handle. And so I decided I'm not going to consume a lot of the material that I was consuming before we voted. I'm not going to do it, because you have to know what you can handle. Antonio, did you want to make a comment?
No, my point is just, especially traditional media and and online as well, they depend from clicks, so they're always looking for bad things all over the place. Mm-hmm. So that's what people click, and there are so many good things happening around the world, and they usually don't make the news. So unless if you are actively searching for them, they usually never come into your feed ever. No, or they may have, from time to time, but most of the time you just have those clickbait news trying to alarm you all over. So it's a challenge for us to filter the news that are in our feeds. But if you look to to the to all the data that is out there. I have to say that I see a lot of good things happening every day, but you end up seeing just the small things that sometimes bring negativity to the feed.
There's a really new and amazing field of journalism emerging, and it's called restorative narrative. And if you go to ivoh.org, you can read about it. But the whole idea about restorative narrative is, instead of showing communities and individuals in a state of brokenness, you show the roots of the strength and the resilience. So if, heaven forbid, a big storm comes through and wipes out a town, you don't just put the cameras on the devastation. You show, the little plant reemerging from the soil and the people pulling together to fix things in the community. And I think we can apply that lens to even stories about mental health, disability and stuff. I mean, how awful is it? Like I said, how awful would it have been if I had shone the light on my family and said, oh my gosh, this is a train wreck of a family. I would never do that. It's like, these are the struggles we went through. This is what we learned. This is how we're so much stronger and more capable and competent and more forged together than we might otherwise have been if we hadn't faced some of these earlier struggles. So I think we have to challenge the media. And I also think we have to take responsibility for our clicks, because if we only click on a horrible thing happened and you'll never guess what happened next, if we only click on that, that's what takes over the internet, right? So.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons that I really like positive news. It's www.positive.news, and it's a really nice antidote to all of the negativity that you see in the mainstream media. For example, they've got a great article, "What Went Right in 2016?" If you listen to the mainstream media, you wouldn't think there was a lot, but some positive stuff happened. So, for instance, there was, there were, and even this year in January, 2 days before the inauguration, we had the change to Section 508 and it updated disability legislation in the States and bringing it more up to date with and in line with common practice around the globe. So there is always a balance of good and bad things happening. I agree with you that it's all too easy to get sucked into the maelstrom of negativity that is the news. It's my 10 p.m. doom fix as I turn on the TV, it is sometimes difficult. And like Deborah, I've stopped looking at certain things, and that's not because I want to be willfully ignorant. And people need to understand that I'm aware of what's going on, but I just choose not to let that overwhelm what's going on in my life.
Let me share the story that happened in my native country, in Portugal. So we had election for the president of the republic. So we have a new president, and his main goal was to change and to create a more positive environment within society. So previously it was all about paying the debt, being broke, and then he started. I need to restore empathy and the relationship between the president and citizens, and that's what he's trying to do. Just a few weeks ago, he went to a hospital, and for 2 hours he was telling stories for kids that were there in the hospital, and he spent his time there for 2 hours telling stories. So, and this is also is also a good sign for other politicians who are in the political environment in Portugal about the attitude that you are expected to have if you want to build something and to create engagement with the population that you are responsible for.
Yes. I think that's a great example. And I think if I could send one message to politicians, like, everybody's having these conversations and asking us to engage and so on. It's not enough to just ask people to share their input on 10,000 things, which seems to happen a lot. You also have to listen to that input, and you have to do something with it. Like, please don't make me fill out one more government survey asking for my input on something only to feel like it's going to live in a filing cabinet drawer till the end of time. Because then I get jaded, and I don't want to be jaded. That destroys my soul. So
You know, I also, and you had said this before, and I'm going to repeat it because I thought it's very wise. But I find that when I get in a place where I'm overwhelmed by my life, which sometimes feels frequent, it's been for me. It's been a little bit of a rough start to this beautiful 2017. But I believe I've heard many times people say, if you want something, give it away. So if you want empathy, you know, if you want love, if you want somebody to understand you, if you want peace, find some way to give that to another person, and that's how it comes back to you. And I really do believe that. I try to be very kind to people because that's what we're here for, is to be nice to each other. And I think it's important to, you know, accept that we are whole, multi-dimensional beings. I know, you know, we talk sometimes about Neil having dyslexia, and or Sir Richard Branson having dyslexia. And I read an article about, you know, Richard Branson jumping out of an airplane, and because of his dyslexia, he actually pulled the wrong cord and he almost died through a parachute. Yeah, whoops. So there can be real consequences to individuals that have. Yeah. But at the same time, that can be your superhuman strength. It can be the way that you change lives. I know that Neil has changed a lot of lives by coming out and really talking about his story. You know, here's this great leader in the United Kingdom doing really amazing things himself. And so I think it's so empowering to others to admit that, you know, we're not perfect. And that's why your work really, really speaks to me. It's, you know, and I also talk a lot about my own family, and my daughter even has come to me and said, stop telling people I have Down syndrome, even though she does. But so we've agreed that I can use the term trisomy 21, which is another terminology for it. But she is tired of me using her as the poster child for all people with Down syndrome.
Yep.
So interesting stuff. So I can really relate with a lot of the stuff that you've done. And I think you're a brilliant writer. So I appreciate that you're out there being honest and being authentic, because I think right now we need that more than ever before. So.
We absolutely do. Yeah. That shared humanity, and what you said about when you're going through a struggle yourself, going back to my earlier stillbirth, when my baby was stillborn at 26 weeks because of an umbilical cord knot, I felt like I didn't know how I was going to go on. It was just like a heart-wrenching experience. And I think the thing that got me through it was helping another mother who was even more devastated. I could hardly imagine somebody more devastated, but she was actively suicidal. And so being able to sort of like be a lifeline for her, it took the focus on just myself. And I think that it's funny. I felt like I was at this sort of crossroads in my life. And I remember thinking, I'm at a path here, and there's a fork in the road, and I have the choice. I can let this experience ruin my life or drive me completely crazy, or I can find a way to find meaning and purpose from it. And I chose that path because this path did not have a lot of appeal to me. And that's sort of been like the way I've approached my writing career. That's not to say there haven't been times I've told the universe, I want to write something frivolous next. I want the universe to assign me the assignment of, researching spas of the world and having to lie on beaches and stuff. But the universe never gives me those flipping assignments. They give them to somebody else. So I just figured this is the path I'm walking. I guess I'll have to self-finance all those spa trips someday.
That's right. Tie them into your mental health work. Going to the spa can really I can see it right now. I can see it.
Well, you need to crowdfund your bucket list.
Spas.
Yes. I think you do need to spend some money on self-care, and we shouldn't consider it selfish to want to spend some money on things that we enjoy. I think often we do. Often we see, it's viewed as indulgence. So we've had a kind of we went through decades of sort of mega consumerism.
Yes.
And I think what we've seen with the younger generation is actually we're less consumer focused and less consumption focused than we were previously. So the sort of buying happiness isn't necessarily, or
Right.
buying objects to fuel happiness isn't something that necessarily works in the long term. You get a very short-term fix.
Right.
You say, oh, I'm high as I buy this thing, and you get by. It's almost the sort of the kickback comes before you even get home, as you think, oh my goodness, I've just spent X amount of money on this thing. But equally, there are things that you can go and enjoy, and eating out, spending time with friends and family, or going away on holiday. Something that we should do, because you need that space and you need those life experiences to take you away from the daily grind. So we ought not to feel too bad about ourselves when we do indulge. And
I totally agree. I have this sort of almost like a sign in front of my eyes at any point that tries to sort of jump out at me. It says, like, self-care isn't selfish, it's self-preservation. And if you're not taking care of yourself, then there's nothing left to give to other people. So I use that as my justification, of course, to buy, really good tea as opposed to like the horrible schleck that you can sometimes get stuck drinking, and really good soap. So, if you ever did one of those financial planning pie charts at the end of the year, it would be crazy. Mine would be like soap, tea, books, spending time at the cottage, that kind of thing. You're like, oh yeah, and then those other essential things all squished in there. So.
Yeah, mine would be good coffee. But yes, great. Thank you very much, Anne. It's been a pleasure talking with you today, and we really look forward to you joining us
everybody.
on Twitter tomorrow night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.